Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Professor Jonathan Rynhold, the head of the Department of Political Studies at Bar Ilan University in Israel, and a senior researcher at the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. Together, we talk about how Israeli public opinion has evolved since October 7th, the divisions within Israeli national debate, and Israeli attitudes toward President Biden. Then I continue the conversation with Todman and Leah Hickert to discuss the dynamics in Israeli strategic thinking and President Biden's efforts to move the conflict closer to resolution. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Jonathan, welcome to Babel.
Thank you.
Where is Israeli public opinion now? How has it changed since October 7th? And how has it changed in the last 10 years?
At the beginning of this war, there was a very strong, unified sense of purpose. It was very clear to all Israelis, not only Israeli Jews, but also Israel's Arab citizens, what Israel needed to do. It needed to defeat Hamas, and it needed to use a lot of military force to do that. And that kind of bound the country together. The horizon of what you do afterwards was a long, long way off. What's happened over the last few months is as we approach the critical elements of which there's more disagreement. So whether getting the hostages back is more important, or whether bringing Hamas down as the governmental authority in Gaza is more important. That begins to have a stronger impact in the debate. And also it's become intertwined with perhaps the end of this unity government that the center and the left are looking to leave. So the third element I would say is that Israelis are becoming somewhat more tired. Our younger members of society, who's between 18 and 25, who are carrying the bulk of this. Many of them have been fighting in Gaza since October with only maybe a week off here and a day off there. That's it. That's very, very tiring for a lot of people. And under those kind of circumstances, the criticisms of the higher echelons, be they the political or sometimes the military, but mainly the political, becomes sharper. In terms of the last 10 years, I think really that what we've seen is two things. One, we've seen a hardening of the opinion that there is no partner for peace on the Palestinian side, that even if Israel was to give more than the Israeli public believes correct to the Palestinians in the form of a state and certain borders and half of Jerusalem, all of that, even then, Israelis don't believe they would get the minimal level of peace that they would want, which they would think of in terms of, when my daughter goes to eat pizza in Jerusalem, she won't be blown up. It's a very, very minimal. And so that lack of faith has destroyed the peace camp, and then destroyed also the centrists, because the centrists said, well, look, we can't have peace, but let's disengage from Gaza. Let's disengage from Lebanon. And when the disengagement from Lebanon and from Gaza led to lots and lots of missiles landing on Israel, then most Israelis say, don't talk to me about the longer term problems of two-state solution and Jewish majorities and all of that. Just stop the missiles, make sure they don't land on my apartment. And while that's how most of the public see it, that created an opening for the more ideological right in the Knesset. So people have not suddenly become en masse ideologically right-wing, but the solutions that were offered by the center and left are seen to have failed. And so the right managed to gain a foothold. And so people on the far right, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, have an unprecedented level of influence on Israeli politics, which doesn't really reflect the breadth of attitudes in Israeli society.
So it feels like there are contradictory instincts. One is we're tired of what we're doing. A second is there's really no alternative to what we're doing. As you said, it's a lot of the young people, a lot of your students, former students, who are in the middle of all of this. What is the mood on campus among these young people? Is it different from what we hear about the Israeli public at large?
So Israeli campuses tend to be much quieter places than American campuses politically. And a large part of that is because Israelis study later. They've been in the army for 2.5, 3 years. And perhaps even more interesting is in the last decade or so, the number of Arab students at my own university has gone up from about 1% to about 14%. You hear a lot of Arabic. You see two women speaking Arabic between them, one with a head covering and one without. And yet it's very quiet on our campus. There's no palpable tension. And the president of the university says he keeps quiet about it because he knows that if he was to say something positive, someone would make sure that the atmosphere suddenly became a lot nastier. It's not that we don't know that in the background there aren't a lot of stresses. And at the beginning of the war, Arab students didn't always turn up to class. I think they were concerned about the response, but now they do. And it can be a difficult thing to navigate, particularly in the politics department. But I have to say, so far, it's been very impressive. I think the students who are fighting, I think that they're mainly wrapped up in either fighting or making sure that they get the allowances that they need in order to, pass the exam. But it's all really very practical.
Getting back to the broader climate in Israel, it seems to me, from where I sit, that there's very little reporting in the Hebrew language press about the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, which is a real difference from both the international Israeli press, which is in English, and international newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, and others. Is it accurate that the Hebrew language press really isn't covering issues of civilian conditions in Gaza? Is it changing? What kinds of other sources are Israelis plugging into, or does it just not matter?
There's no doubt that we see less of the suffering in Gaza than you would if you were in London, New York, or Los Angeles. But we do see it. We know it's there. And actually, in some ways, we see it more. And that's because when you have 300,000 young Israelis in Gaza and they come home from the weekend, that's what they talk about. And from their perspective, they've got a split second to decide whether this is a woman or a child or a young man or a youth, 15, 16. Has he got a weapon? So for them, that's how they are processing it. There's a lot of stress. I can't tell you that every soldier cares about it, but I hear these stories regularly. And those are the things that they will talk about, or they'll talk about the risks that they had to take. The child of a friend of mine, she's the medic for 3 tanks. That means she has to get out the tank if there's someone injured in the other tank. But because she's small, she can fit in this little space at the back of a tank. And so she saved 4 soldiers' lives because she could get in this space and give them the first aid. Why do I tell that story? Because that's where the Israeli public is. It feels like it can't allow itself to be too emotionally engaged in the suffering on the other side because it needs to win. And afterwards, I would imagine that in time that will begin to look different, at least for some Israelis. But for the public at large, I think they are extremely focused on either the hostages or winning or both. There are Israelis who do care a lot about this, and quietly and behind the scenes, Israeli organizations have been actually facilitating aid going into Gaza. But the ability to do that, given the type of government we have, requires keeping quiet about it. The government knows, but if it was to become public, then that would create a political problem. And so what you read about is all the attempts of the far right to block aid. And that is also a political problem because the prime minister feels his government will collapse without these extremists.
I want to come back to hostages, but I just want to pick up on the thread you suggested that there are some soldiers who care a lot about rules of war and differentiating victims. And then it's clear there are some people in the Israeli military and Israeli society who says, look, they're all terrorists or they support them and we're going to win. There's the fact that the military itself has a strong split on these issues manifests itself in any visible ways? Or are there people who say, this is making our job so much harder and it has to stop?
The irony is that the civilians tend to be more gung-ho than the high-ranking officers. And that's for a number of reasons. First of all, the social background of a lot of the intelligence officers and the strategists is more small L liberal. The fighting soldiers and elite units may be more right-wing sometimes and more religious, but they are very disciplined. And that military discipline can constrain things. It tends to be non-elite units of people who are sort of less committed, and that's usually where the bad stuff happens. There are officers, obviously, who take a less humanitarian view, but I think that division is usually more subtle in the field. It's what degree of risk. And there's no doubt that in general, the rules of engagement of the IDF have been loosened in this conflict. And that's because the level of threat is far greater and the losses are far greater. And the IDF will always think about, do we use a 1-ton bomb? Do we use a 2-ton bomb? You know, they don't move without lawyers because in practical terms, it's not only a moral issue, it's a political issue with the ICJ and the ICC. And so there's an understanding within the hierarchy that fighting the war according to the rules as best you can is important to being able to do the job. On the other hand, sometimes they just want to get the job done. And the way the Israeli army works is that officers in the field have a huge amount of leeway in deciding things. So that's why it can look very different in different places and at different times. I think the emphasis, though, it remains on getting the job done.
Have you seen a change in the way Israelis are talking about the war because of the ICC and ICJ actions?
Yeah, there's no doubt that that has helped Netanyahu and the right. All the polling shows that, the ICC and the ICJ, and also the recognition by Spain, Ireland, and Norway of a Palestinian state. From the Israeli perspective, all of this fits into Hamas's strategy, which is you put your fighters underground protected and you put your civilians above ground and your weapons above ground, so that either Israel kills your civilians and then has huge diplomatic and political problems and perhaps will be stopped from destroying you, or Israeli soldiers get killed because they're careful with civilians. That's the Hamas strategy. And so the sense that it doesn't matter what we do, we'll never have the level of understanding for the type of dilemmas that we have from the rest of the world feeds into the right-wing narrative in Israel that the world is against us. President Biden bought a hell of a lot of credit at the beginning of this war, but it is running down. And although he didn't really stop much of the weapons coming to Israel, and Israelis are not fully aware of just how much weaponry America's supplied and just how critical that's been. So the public tends to have a view that they're sort of lessening their thankfulness to the president, and Netanyahu's been rising because of these things.
Well, you talked about the military being concerned about the ICC and ICJ issues, but your feeling is that's part of the growing divergence between the military and the civilians. The political leadership has been using it to make hay. The military leadership has found it increasingly constraining. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, the political leadership are using it to make hay. It's not hard for them. Listen, if the president of the United States says it's outrageous, then Israelis are only going to feel it's extremely outrageous, right? And so that's the first thing. I don't think they have to work very hard to make political hay out of it. And the second thing I would say is it's not so much that the military don't feel that sense of outrage. It's that their main concern is we need to be able to do what we need to do in Gaza. And therefore, we look at the ICC and ICJ from a practical point of view. How do we navigate this? How do we keep the Americans on board? It's just a professional view. They share the same gut instincts, but they have to actually think, well, what do we actually do about it?
You had talked about Hamas putting its fighters below ground, leaving civilians and weapons above ground. Of course, hostages are also below ground. And it seems that there's a rising debate in Israel about the priority that freeing hostages should take vis-a-vis militarily defeating Hamas. Has the hostage issue become a game changer in the way Israelis are thinking about this? Do you expect it to rise or fall in importance as Israelis think about the strategy for going forward?
There are two elements to this. There's the atmospherics and what goes on the streets and demonstrations. And in that sense, you very much see the hostage issue becoming more important. But then when you start to look at the polling and you ask people questions, it's not clear that there's that big a change in the priorities. So if you say to Israelis a complete ceasefire in exchange for the hostages, the majority will be against it. If you say a 6-week pause and then we can start again and we get the hostages, then you'll get a majority in favor of it. Obviously, the president deliberately kept that very vague. So you can have a debate in Israel. It's a bit of shadow boxing in a way, because we haven't seen an offer on the table that the majority of the Israeli public would support. That's why Netanyahu always says, but we're not giving up on destroying Hamas. In other words, I'm prepared to make some concessions. More terrorists can be released. The ceasefire can be for a bit longer. But it's hard to see just a complete ceasefire. It might be that the public will go along with it because they will think they can restart the war in 6 weeks when actually they're entering a track that they can't deviate from. That's possible. But if you tell them up front, then a majority will be against it. But it's also interrelated with the discontent with Netanyahu. So the strongest feeling in Israel is that Netanyahu does what's good for Netanyahu politically, and that he is unable to distinguish between what's good for Israel and what's good for Netanyahu. And it's what's good for Netanyahu that defines what's good for Israel. And so people say, well, he doesn't want to compromise on the hostages because he wants the war to go on as long as possible so he can stay in power and all of that. Now, one can believe that and believe that he is that cynical and still believe that he's not wrong about not ending the war until Israel has brought Hamas down. As General Petraeus said, you can't really put out 80% of a fire. You've got to put the whole thing out. So I think that there's a confusion there of two things coming together. And the lack of clarity about the president's latest plan only adds to that. So for the president to say, I don't trust Netanyahu, a lot of Israelis will agree with that, and probably a majority, but that doesn't mean they're going to agree with everything that he said.
You've written, I think, very thoughtfully about the future shape of politics in Israel and what coalitions can look like. I've seen a number of accounts that suggest that even if the government fell and you called new elections and formed a new government, Netanyahu would be in power for the next 5 months in Israel because of the time between now and the elections and then the time of government formation. How does that affect any sort of endgame going forward?
So a Netanyahu in power with a war going on in a serious way is one scenario, and a Netanyahu in power where the war is more or less ended is a different scenario. If the war is more or less ended, you're going to see massive public demonstrations in Israel against Netanyahu, but you may also see a reaction to that and major demonstrations in favor of him. The dynamic in the war itself, I don't think it will be critical, because even if Israel continues this war on a lower flame and wants to get rid of Hamas, then it's going to take a lot. Even when the big fight ends, let's say Israel takes Rafah, it's still going to be months and months of establishing order so that somebody else can take over. The issue would more be how that would be synchronized diplomatically. So it would, I think, distance what the Saudis and the Biden administration want, which is to link a resolution to Gaza to normalization of Israel's relations with Saudi Arabia and a defense treaty or guarantee between Israel and the Saudis. But the only thing is, given the, I think, rightful cynicism which Israelis have towards the prime minister, it's not impossible that he might come to believe that ending the war and blaming Biden and the Americans for not allowing Israel to finish the job, and then taking advantage of that to then do a deal with the Saudis, that is not impossible. He could do that. It wouldn't surprise me, because I'm not sure that in his heart of hearts, he thinks that getting rid of Hamas is such a good idea. He obviously has to be publicly committed in every way to destroying Hamas. But at the end of the day, this is someone who is cautious, who intrinsically believes that there's no political solution on the horizon, that a Palestinian state is dangerous, and that the PA is not an alternative. And so the more the Palestinians are divided and the more chaotic and weak things are there, that's not necessarily bad. He just can't be the author of it. A lot will depend on his political standing. One of the advantages of an interim government is you can't bring it down. So that means, paradoxically, he's under less pressure from the far right, and therefore moving to the center might make sense. Right? That's where he's lost mainly. It might make sense. So it's not impossible to imagine that scenario.
You talked earlier about how Biden got a lot of credit for coming to Israel in October. There is a sense that the value of that is diminishing over time. Increasingly, it feels to a lot of people like the Israeli leadership is just waiting out President Biden with a sense that he may not be there after November, so it won't really matter. Do you sense that the United States has a window to act under Biden, or do you think that the United States is going to be relevant anyway because the United States is relevant to everything Israel does?
I think the latter. American presidents occasionally think they can walk away from the Middle East, and then it just comes back and hits them in the face. And I'm sure that President Trump would like nothing more than to walk away from the Middle East. He, being a sort of belligerent isolationist, he's very happy to smash Iran if it does something directly against an American citizen or America, but he doesn't respond if it's against the allies. From an Israeli perspective, it's by no means clear that waiting things out is a good idea.
Although Israeli public opinion is much more favorable to Trump than Biden right now.
Sure, in terms of public opinion, you're right. But that's the Israeli public. They look at the symbolic, the grand gesture, and Trump's very truculent language towards the Palestinians or Israel's enemies. That's the thing that they remember. But the IDF and the security establishment will look at the amount of aid, a $14 billion package that Biden has given, the amount of military equipment, the support at the UN, sticking his neck out many times, and they will value that. And they'll worry that President Trump says he doesn't want to give Israel aid, he wants it to be loans. Will he be willing to send 2 aircraft carriers to deter Hezbollah and Iran? President Biden did it quicker than any American president has ever done. That commitment was much quicker and much more complete than 1967 or 1973. It's unprecedented, really. Now, the public don't know that, right? They think America's always been very supportive. The defense establishment does know it. So while it might hope that a Trump administration might be more assertive towards Iran, it's more the public that sort of thinks Trump's a good thing. And I think that those people who think strategically are not sure exactly what's better and value more President Biden. Right-wing politicians are with the public.
I'm wondering, based on all of that, if you feel that Biden really has an opportunity to shape Israeli public discourse, or is it more like a rugby scrum where you're just all sort of locked shoulder to shoulder and trying to push inches one way or the other?
I think there is something he could do, but I don't think he will do it. And that is to allow very clearly Israel to bring down the Hamas regime by destroying the remaining armed forces in Rafah. And coming to an agreement with Israel that it will establish order there over a few months. And at that point, he can pivot to, now I want the Palestinians to take over. I want a reinvigorated Palestinian Authority. And particularly at that juncture, when for Israelis, it becomes a choice between our children doing 60 days reserve duty every year in Gaza, or, most Israelis don't believe him, but at least isn't that bad and practice the Palestinian Authority. And then we could get in return for that something with the Saudis. At that juncture, if he can do that pivot, then that would make a difference. And if he was to choose a governor of Gaza, so it's under the PA, but you have Salam Fayyad as prime minister. Now, Salam Fayyad is the Palestinian leader who has credibility with the Israeli public, not because they love him, but because he can point to the fact, I made it better, I'm not corrupt, and security was better. This is the only guy who delivered. The Gulf Arabs like it for the same reasons. And so that would be my grand strategy if I was advising President Biden. You could do this, but this mistaken belief that Israel's involved in counterinsurgency when it's actually fighting a war. We're not doing Afghanistan and we're not doing Iraq. We're destroying a conventional force and we're bringing down a government. We understand that we can't destroy Hamas as an idea and that there will remain an insurgency. But we're trying to create a different base in Gaza. And I think that if you consent to part one of what Israelis want, then you will have a lot of leverage over part two.
But it almost sounds like a 1-2 punch, that the first has become more permissive of Israeli military goals and then become much less permissive of an unwillingness to move toward American Arab political goals afterward.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying the bottom line for Israelis is the security stuff. So if you're very good on that, your demands are in areas that don't directly affect security, it will be a lot more difficult for the right in Israel to make their case. And a tired Israeli public will potentially remember Joe Biden and what he has done in this war. And it will offer them some hope, because the Israeli public right now doesn't see any hope that things could get better. So if you can allow them to say to themselves, well, we've got rid of the main problem, and here is a potential way forward, which is not that dangerous. We control the security situation on the outside. We control the border with Egypt. Let's see if Fayyad can do what he did in the West Bank and Gaza. Then we don't have to worry about all the extra extremism that's happened in the West Bank. And if I'm Palestinian, I can still say it's the Palestinian Authority. I can still say that Abbas and Ramallah, they decide all the foreign policy, they do all the negotiations. And the Biden administration has always said, we want you to recommit to a two-state solution, but we see it as over the horizon, not in the next 5 minutes. So that's something I think the Israeli public can hear, but only after Rafah is done, because otherwise the feeling is that this is instead of, and the overwhelming feeling in Israel is first, we have to win this.
How would an American government hold the Israelis to phase two after they complete phase one, especially if Biden may not be there to enforce adherence to phase two?
If it's Biden, what he has done that I thought was really smart was he made the distinction that I'm talking about by continually supplying Israel with the weapons that America thought were needed, and some that they thought were too much, didn't supply, but didn't stop Israel being effective. On the other hand, he sanctioned the most extreme settlers. And that was very smart, because what it said is, I'm helping you on security, the thing that most of you care about. But we're a democracy, and the reason that we're supporting you is because you're a democracy. That's the reason we're supporting Taiwan. That's the reason we're supporting Ukraine. That's the reason we're on your side against Iran. So you need to understand, we're not going to indulge you on that stuff. But you also need to understand, we're going to protect you whatever on the other stuff. So it's like saying, we want to make sure the Palestinians have a decent life. This is not a problem in Israel. Nobody's going to say they shouldn't have a decent life. The problem is always the fear of them building up military power and then attacking Israel or eroding the Israeli public's morale or creating a sense of a war every day, a threat round every corner. So I think that strategy of saying, look, a two-state solution, but only one that's safe for Israel. We're only asking you not to have more settlements. To combine that with, we're supporting you on the security, is, I think, the sweet spot. And what you have with President Biden and indeed President Trump, should he want, is a president with about as much capital in the bank as you can have, right? And a prime minister, if it's Netanyahu, who is shaky on these things. And the fact that this current government is offering the ultra-Orthodox exemptions from the army is making mainstream Israel extremely angry at this government. If they don't have an enemy to punch, people start looking at what they're doing, and then they don't look quite so good. And the ability to play that, I think, is the best way for America to influence what goes on in Israel.
Jonathan Rynhold, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Professor Rynhold talked about the divisions in Israel's national debate, with public opinion and politicians on one side and military and intelligence officials on the other. How does this split compare to the United States or other countries in the region?
It feels to me like in the United States, it's the politicians who control almost everything. We have a civilian-led military. There are some people, especially recently in the Republican Party, who've talked about the deep state. But I think there's a fairly large consensus that it's appropriate that the politicians are in control and the military serves the direction of civilian leadership. Israel's a little bit different, I think, because of its history. All the countries in the region are different because not only are there not democratic politics with politicians who take the high road, but in many cases, the roles of defense, intelligence, foreign policy are sort of considered sovereignty ministries, which in monarchies are often but not always reserved to members of the ruling family. There's certainly ones that in many cases are reserved to trusted partners. And so in a lot of the region's authoritarian regimes, you neither have an independent military voice nor a political voice. You have the leadership. Israel is really a very different model. The deep state, if you want to call that in Israel, is pretty deep. As we heard in the discussion, it trends a little bit further to the left than a lot of the public, but it's an important decision maker. And it will be interesting to see how what seems to be a rising struggle between Netanyahu and the retired generals who helped constitute his war cabinet, how that plays out.
It's interesting what you said about the civilian controlled government in the US. I suppose there's a reason why usually the Secretary of Defense can't be someone who has served in the military for the past, I forget how many years it is, 5 or so years. And I think these actors are trained to think in just very different terms. Military and intelligence officials are trained to come up with options and are not really meant to think about those options in very emotional terms. Often, I think they're thinking on a slightly different time horizon. You might get politicians thinking more sort of longer term, whereas military leaders might be more focused on achieving whatever mission that is. Which reminds me of the time, was it President Bush stood in front of the mission accomplished banner after the Iraq War? Now, in some ways, that mission had been accomplished. The military mission of toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein had been achieved. But obviously, the longer term political goals had not been achieved at all. And so now we sort of make fun of it when we look back at it. When you look at the region as well, the economic incentives of some militaries also come into play here in an interesting way, which maybe make some differences between the different countries. Militaries in Egypt and in some of the countries are really powerful economic players in their countries' economies. And they have an interest in maintaining this control. They gain resources during wartime, and state resources are diverted towards them. So they might have some economic interests that come into tension with some of these political interests at the same time.
What have you both learned about the tensions between getting hostages home, comprehensively defeating Hamas, while also laying the groundwork for governance in Gaza?
I think something that surprised me that Professor Rynhold said in his interview was the degree to which Israelis still really favor a comprehensive defeat of Hamas. I hadn't fully appreciated that so many Israelis still feel that, because I think outside of Israel, a lot of us sort of look at the situation and think it's not possible to defeat Hamas militarily, and that the prosecution of the war has sort of proven that and has shown just how high the cost is of achieving those aims. And certainly I see the protests in Israel from the families, the relatives of hostages and their supporters. And I thought the hostages really were overwhelmingly the priority here, and that maybe Israelis had shifted away from total defeat of Hamas, which may be incompatible with the release of hostages. And then I think another sort of piece that sort of surprised me about weighing those different options is the idea of the leverage that President Biden has. In Professor Rynhold's assessment, President Biden hasn't yet achieved the leverage over Israelis to be able to say, now you must accept this as it relates to the future of a Palestinian governing structure in Gaza. And I think a lot of Americans looking at the strategy that President Biden put forward would say, he has already achieved that first part of the 1-2 punch, right? He's already devoted so much political capital to supporting Israel, and might be surprised that even more is required to be able to exert that kind of leverage over the future of governance in Gaza.
I was surprised at the sense he had that really you could sequence a lot of these things, that you could very much sequence hostage return and eradicating Hamas and creating governance in Gaza, and that you could stop, you could have a gap between them. I'm not sure that's the American conception of how this can successfully play out. The other thing that I thought was interesting was he hinted that while the Israeli public really wants to eradicate Hamas, he seemed to think that Prime Minister Netanyahu could see some political advantage in Hamas's survival. And that's not an idea I've heard others putting forward.
It definitely seems like President Biden is trying to incite some sort of change in Israeli politics. Did your discussion with Professor Rynhold make that goal seem more or less achievable, Jon?
It's hard to be heard above the hurricane force winds. There's a lot going on in Israel. There's a lot about the future of government, about the roles of different parties, Prime Minister Netanyahu's future, the role of the hostages, the sanctity of life, the long-term ambitions, all those kinds of things. And it felt to me like it was even harder than I had previously anticipated for the United States to really sustain attention in Israel. I think we can get attention for short periods of time, but it really felt to me that after almost 9 months of war, the Israelis are still mostly having an internal conversation. Now, to be fair, the United States was having an internal conversation 2 years after 9/11. And so maybe this is the norm. But while tectonic plates are changing, they're changing more slowly than people looking at both the American political calendar, but also the humanitarian environment in Gaza would like to see.
Thanks for joining me, Jon and Will.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.